I'm moderator for your session. My name is Choi Byung-il, professor at Ewha Women's University. This occasion is to commemorate Korean translated version of much acclaimed book written by Ben Steele. The book is titled The Battle of Bretton Woods. I have poster here. Looks like very much weighted movie poster, John Maynard Keynes versus Harry Dexter White. Ben Steele is a director of international economics at Council on Foreign Relations. He is also founding editor of International Finance. This book is published in 2013, and we have Ben Steele. And so without further ado, I will ask him to give a talk about his book. And after his 30-minute presentation about book, I will have Q&A session, and I will give a chance to join discussion. Ben.
Thank you, Dr. Choi, and thank you also a special thanks to Dr. Haman Asan for translating the book, which is now available in Chinese, Japanese, and Korean. Bretton Woods is a story I decided I wanted to try to tell back in 2009 as the financial crisis was spreading globally, and you had world leaders from French President Nicolas Sarkozy to British Prime Minister Gordon Brown, all calling for, quote-unquote, a new Bretton Woods. I thought it might be a good idea to take a look at the old original Bretton Woods. Surprisingly, there had been very little written on the subject, and it turned out to be a far more fascinating story than I had realized. I'm actually trying to make it into a movie version at the moment. The characters, as I think you'll see, are truly marvelous. They're sort of made for the big screen. A little bit of scene setting. The 1944 Bretton Woods International Monetary Conference is the most important international gathering since the Paris Peace Talks of 1919, 25 years earlier. There are over 700 delegates from 44 allied nations. Now, the conference starts only 3 weeks after the D-Day landings at Normandy. So there's a real sense of sort of cautious optimism in the air among the delegates that we may be at the beginning of the end of the war, and a real sense that, that deliberations meant something. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt attached enormous political significance to the event. He believed that it would help send a message to the enemy Axis powers, that it was the Allies, and of course the United States in particular, that had the compelling vision for the post-war world. He actually believed that this might help to bring the war to an earlier conclusion. But Roosevelt, like his British counterpart Winston Churchill, was not terribly interested in international monetary affairs. So he left the details of the conference, which were terribly important and consequential for the world, to his Treasury Secretary, who you'll see on the right there, Henry Morgenthau. Henry Morgenthau, how shall I put this politely, was not the sharpest tack in the box, as we say in the United States. He had no qualifications for the position. He became Treasury Secretary in 1934. He was an old friend of Roosevelt's from Hyde Park, New York. He had no university degree. He referred to himself as an apple farmer. He was a gentleman apple farmer, but an apple farmer nonetheless. He was one of the rare characters in the Roosevelt administration in that he had the president's ear, but he had nothing to say into it. And so that made him wholly dependent on this man. Harry Dexter White, his deputy, the two had a very sort of a difficult symbiotic relationship over their mutual 12-year career in Washington. White is truly one of the most fascinating American political figures of the 20th century that nobody knows anything about. I'm just going to give you a little flavor of him later on in the presentation, but he is truly a remarkable figure. Now, White and Morgenthau were really economic determinists in terms of their story as to how we arrived at Bretton Woods. They believed It was Britain's exit from the gold exchange standard in 1931 that triggered the currency and trade wars that spread the Great Depression globally and created the environment of misery and anger that paved the path to aggression for Hitler and Mussolini. So they really believed it was economic problems that caused the larger political and then military problems. So they were determined to stamp out currency and trade wars through the establishment of a new international institution, the International Monetary Fund, that would oversee a new fixed exchange rate system based on the US dollar, in which competitive devaluations would no longer be part of the landscape. But they actually had another agenda that was equally important, but perhaps even more consequential. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill famously described American Lend-Lease aid during World War II as, quote unquote, the most unsordid act, that is, the most unselfish act. But he was very painfully aware of the fact that Lend-Lease aid came with very onerous geopolitical conditions attached to it. And those conditions were not attached by Roosevelt himself. They were attached by his Treasury, and in particular, Harry Dexter White and Henry Morgenthau. And there were three particular components of it that were extremely important and consequential in the post-war era. First, after the war, Britain would have to end so-called imperial trade preference. This is the arrangement by which Britain gave itself privileged access to the markets of its colonies and dominions. This was anathema both politically and economically to the Roosevelt administration, which considered the United States to be fundamentally the anti-imperial power in the world. Second, Britain would, at a fixed date, have to make the pound sterling once again fully convertible into US dollars at a fixed rate. That rate would be an extremely overvalued one, which would create enormous problems. And the date that was ultimately set was July 15th, 1947. And this is far more consequential than most historians realize. You can see the British Empire collapsing very rapidly in the first few weeks of 1947 as Britain is running out of dollars and gold and preparing for convertibility when its colonies and dominions would descend on London and ask for dollars in return for their worthless sterling. So over the course of 3 weeks at the beginning of 1947, all these great pillars of British imperial power, Burma, Palestine, India, Greece, they all collapse. This triggers the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. It was incredibly consequential, but FDR's Treasury took no account of this at the time that they made these demands of Britain in 1944. And finally, the third condition was that Britain would, at Bretton Woods, basically have to accept the US dollar as the universal unit of account after the war. The British pound sterling would no longer have a significant reserve currency or trade role in the post-war era. Now, these two aims came together at Bretton Woods, which was very much a show orchestrated to kabuki level by Harry Dexter White. Nothing was left to chance. And here, let me just give you some flavor of how Harry Dexter White spoke. This is Harry Dexter White preparing the American delegation, who are mostly politicians, going into negotiations with their counterparts at Bretton Woods. Here he is explaining what this is all about. He says, gold in Fort Knox is why the U.S. is in such a powerful position at this conference. It is why we dominate the financial world. If only England were in this position, it would be a very different story. This is a man who is literally obsessed from his first arrival in Washington in 1933 with the relative economic and political power of the United States and the United Kingdom. For example, I found a memo in his archives at Princeton dated 1936. This is 8 years before Bretton Woods, when he's no more than a bureaucratic temp at the Treasury. He's nothing. And he's already planning this conference. And he writes in the memo, the more sterling countries there are in the world, the stronger will be England's position around a conference table should an international conference take place. So he's already planning this face-off with the British, which would come only 8 years later. And here's Henry Morgenthau explaining to President Truman after President Roosevelt dies in April of 1945 what he felt Bretton Woods was all about. He said, I wanted, quote unquote, to move the financial center of the world from London and Wall Street to the United States Treasury. Note the "and Wall Street" part. This is really an anti-banker agenda as well. They want to make sure that New York has no role in this environment. So why did the British ultimately sign up to this deal? Well, as the great British economist and British Bretton Woods delegate Lionel Robbins put it at the conference, and I quote, "We needed the cash." That's what it was about. They needed the cash to survive the war. Let me say a little about the two personalities who were the sort of driving forces behind the conference. On the British side, the head of the British delegation, John Maynard Keynes, arguably the most important economist of the 20th century, but he was also the very first international celebrity economist. Today we're used to figures like Paul Krugman and Nouriel Roubini jetting around the world with the media waiting on their every pronouncement. But it was Keynes who actually created this role at Bretton Woods, which was very much a huge media event. And the American delegation were extremely angry about the attention that was being paid to the great man by the American media, which didn't particularly like him, but were not shy in explaining to the American public that this man and his delegation were vastly superior in intellectual quality to the American delegation. So Morgenthau, for example, wouldn't even let Keynes nominate him, Henry Morgenthau, to be president of the conference at the opening ceremonies. He didn't want him anywhere near the podium. As for Harry Dexter White, he made Keynes in charge of the commission to create the World Bank in order to keep him away from the main event, which was creating the International Monetary Fund and the new dollar-based international monetary architecture. Now, Keynes was a very perspicacious negotiator. He understood the game that the Americans were playing with the British. Let me give you some language that Keynes used. A few years before the conference in 1942, he warns his government, quote unquote, of the need to guard against the present emergency being used as an opportunity for picking out the eyes of the British Empire, and to prevent Britain, quote unquote, becoming a satellite of the United States. He said there were quarters in the United States intending to use the grant of post-war credits to us as an opportunity for imposing upon the world the American conception of the international economic system. So Keynes is very aware of the American agenda, but he really doesn't have the ability to resist it. And in many senses, despite the fact that Keynes had all the qualities of a good diplomat in the sense that he was extremely brilliant and very, very articulate and eloquent, he was in many senses the world's worst diplomat, in that he was utterly arrogant and far more interested in humiliating his opponents intellectually than in converting them. Also, he had one characteristic that I think a diplomat should never, ever have, and that is that he had a personal stake in the outcome of the negotiations. That is, at Bretton Woods, he wanted to be known as the man who overthrew the gold standard and replaced it with a new, rational, managed economic system. He knew very well that in the short run, it would be Harry Dexter White's system that would prevail, but he believed that ultimately the world would see sense and would adopt his system. Senior British civil servants, however, were often very scathing about Keynes's approach. They did not want to sign up to this deal being posed by the U.S. Treasury, and many of them wanted to avoid Bretton Woods entirely. For example, one Treasury official, Sir Richard Clarke, Otto Clarke as he was called, argued that the British could have borrowed the money from other places, such as the U.S. Export-Import Bank, which didn't have this geopolitical agenda. They could have borrowed more from the Canadians. They could have borrowed more privately. And indeed, I did discover in the archives that there was, just before the conference in May of 1944, a rearguard action launched against Bretton Woods by a group of influential New York bankers who met with the British financial secretary in New York and basically offered him a deal. You, the British, walk away from Bretton Woods and we will organize a $3 billion a dollar loan to you after the war. But your part of the deal is you walk away from this conference. They were very much against the establishment of the International Monetary Fund, which they saw as a competitor to their business, and they were very much against the Roosevelt administration. Many in the British government wanted to pursue this idea, but Keynes was staunchly against it and refused. Keynes's bust-ups with Harry Dexter White were absolutely legendary. Part of this derives from the fact that the two men come from very, very different backgrounds. Keynes is the son of two Cambridge academics. He was raised by a governess and servants. He was expected to go on to great things in life. Harry Dexter White, who was 9 years younger than Keynes, born in 1892 in working-class Boston, he was the youngest of 7 children of Lithuanian Jewish immigrants. His father was a hardware peddler. His parents died when he was very young. He actually dropped out of school in his first attempt to get a degree to go back into the family hardware business. He was very intelligent, though, eventually went back to school, got his undergraduate degree at age 30, and went on to Harvard to get his PhD. He wanted, interestingly enough, to go to Moscow to study Soviet economic planning, but before he could do that, he got called to Washington, met Henry Morgenthau, and the two formed this great relationship of theirs that ultimately culminated in Bretton Woods. But these two men really had a very, very difficult relationship. White worshipped Keynes as an intellectual. He used to get physically sick before going into negotiations with Keynes because he didn't want to humiliate himself in front of his colleagues. What did Keynes think of White? He said, quote unquote, "He has not the faintest conception how to behave or to observe the rules of civilized discourse." He referred to his first draft for Bretton Woods as, quote unquote, "the work of a lunatic or some sort of bad joke." The most memorable bust-up between the two came in October of 1943. Mind you, they're negotiating for 2 years before we get into Bretton Woods. Keynes takes White's most recent draft for the conference, throws it on the floor, and yells, "This is intolerable. It is yet another Talmud." Talmud, of course, being a reference to the fact that White was Jewish. White responded in kind. He said, "Well, we will try to produce something which your highness can understand." So these two had a fabulous relationship. Now, their visions for Bretton Woods really were very, very different. Let me describe just briefly what the two men saw as being the central pillars here. White wanted to establish a new international monetary system based on the US dollar, which would itself be indelibly backed by gold. And the US controlled about 2/3 of the global monetary reserve, gold reserves at the time, so they were in a position to enforce this. Keynes wanted to create a new supranational currency, which he was going to call Bancor, which would come to supplant the US dollar internationally, ultimately. White wanted the organization, the IMF, to be very powerful, and he wanted countries to have to get permission from the IMF to devalue their currency. Keynes actually wanted countries to be able to devalue or revalue according to a formula that would be set in advance. White envisioned the IMF being very powerful with many hundreds of technically trained economists, much like it is today. How could he protect the United States from a powerful IMF? He would give the United States a veto. So the United States would never be threatened by this organization. Keynes saw the IMF not as being an institution, but sort of a mechanism. It was an ATM or a cash machine for countries running budget and current account deficits. He wanted the organization to have very weak directors and just be a place you could get cash if you needed it. White wanted the quotas in the organization to be determined by how much cold, hard cash, securities, gold you put in. Keynes didn't like that idea because Britain had very little in terms of liquid assets, so he wanted it to be determined by the share of international trade which the country accounted for, which was very convenient for the British, which were bankrupt but did a lot of trade. Finally, White and the Americans wanted the organization to be based in Washington, D.C. Keynes wanted the world to be split between the British and the Americans. Half the world would be ruled out of London and half the world would be ruled out of New York. He was determined to keep it away from Washington because of the political significance of Washington, D.C. Now, finally, the most interesting part of the story, I think, is how the heads of the two institutions came to be chosen. It may seem curious to you, given that the IMF was and still is by far the more powerful of the two Bretton Woods institutions, the other one being the World Bank. How is it that a European wound up running the organization? And here is the story. In January of 1946, President Truman nominates Harry Dexter White to be the first U.S. executive director of the fund, and he's going to nominate him to be the first managing director of the fund, the head of the fund. But this was stopped by one man. Let's see if the non-Americans in the room can recognize this. Any non-Americans know who this is? FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover prepares a long memorandum for the president arguing that he should not ever consider such a thing because he, Hoover, can prove that White is in fact a Soviet agent. Spoiler alert, he was. We can talk a little later about what the evidence was, but Hoover did not know a fraction of the evidence. Most of that actually came out in the late 1990s. Many of you may have seen this movie about the Enigma, German codes that were cracked on the British side. Well, the Americans cracked the Soviet codes for their wartime cables, and many of these were not decrypted until decades after the end of the war. And under the Freedom of Information Act, I got 13,000 pages on White from the FBI, which included 18 Soviet intelligence cables mentioning White and his activities. It's a remarkable story. Truman did not trust Hoover, but he knew he had an enormous political problem on his hands. And he decided he would try to hush this up by leaving White as the executive director. He thought he could quarantine him there, but he could not appoint another American to sit above him because that would raise questions about why the architect of the fund was being passed over. So the Americans concocted a new narrative that they took to the British just before the IMF was inaugurated in Savannah in March of '46. They told Keynes that they decided after due consideration that they wanted presidency of the World Bank in order to secure the confidence of the American investment community, blah, blah, blah. And it would be ungracious of the Americans to take the heads of both institutions. Now, the Americans were anything but gracious during this period, so this was clearly a nonsensical story which shocked Keynes. Briefly, was Bretton Woods actually a success? Now, this may sound like a shocking question since the so-called Bretton Woods era from 1946 to 1971 was an era of great economic growth, recovery from the war, revival of international trade. But I would argue that almost none of this can be put down to Bretton Woods. First of all, the IMF was basically mothballed by the Truman administration. Its role was ultimately filled by the Marshall Plan. 3 years later, in 1947, which was in many ways a complete repudiation of everything that FDR's top foreign economic policymakers believed about the post-war world. First, that the British Empire could be peaceably dismantled, that the Soviets could be co-opted into a permanent peacetime alliance, that Germany could be deindustrialized and dismembered, the so-called Morgenthau Plan for post-war Germany, and finally, that a world trading system could be revived on the basis of short-term loans from a new IMF. All this turned out to be complete nonsense. And 3 years later, the Marshall Plan was introduced to address this problem. And that was based on grants and not loans, as the IMF had been created. Secondly, it wasn't until really 1961 that the monetary system established at Bretton Woods actually began. In 1961, the first 9 European countries met the convertibility requirements of the IMF Articles of Agreement. By that time, the system is already coming under enormous strain as the United States is losing gold reserves. Countries like France were demanding their gold back. They didn't believe that the United States could continue backing their currency with gold. 10 years later, President Nixon closes the gold window and the U.S. dollar is no longer convertible. I think there's some fascinating parallels between the US-China disputes over international monetary architecture today and those we had in the 1940s. In the 1940s, the US was the world's largest international creditor, the UK the world's largest international debtor. Today, China is the world's largest international creditor, the United States is the world's largest international debtor. And it's fascinating that Chinese officials today use precisely the language that the American Treasury used in the 1940s to describe the problems in the global monetary system. That is all the fault of the profligate debtors with their loose fiscal and monetary policies. The debtors, particularly in the United States, need to control themselves. This was the narrative the Americans took into Bretton Woods. The Americans have completely dumped their 1940s position and now sound exactly like Keynes and the British in the 1940s. Many of you may remember in 2010 when Treasury Secretary Tim Geithner proposed that caps should be placed on persistent current account surpluses. This is something that Harry Dexter White and the Americans fiercely resisted at Bretton Woods. They said there would be no foreign interference in the American current account surplus. But of course, when we were in a very different position, we took the opposite perspective. Let me just very briefly try to run through some legacy issues left over from the collapse of the Bretton Woods system. Interestingly, Harry Dexter White predicted that the United States commitment to gold convertibility would never, of course, come into question. But if the United States should ever abandon this commitment, the US dollar would have no international role whatsoever. That turned out not to be the case. He was wrong in that regard. But let's take the issue of Ukraine, a fascinating country we discussed in the last panel here on US-Russia relations. And you can see how powerful the political role of the US dollar is in the case of Ukraine. In April 2013, the Yanukovych government walks out of negotiations with the IMF over a $15 billion financial assistance package. They decide that despite having an 8% current account and budget deficit, they're going to muddle through by continuing to borrow money internationally. They issue a $1.25 billion 10-year Eurobond at a 7.5% interest rate. Everything's going swimmingly until May 22nd, 2013, Benjamin Bernanke makes his famous taper comments. Many of you may remember this was a very, very modest, carefully hedged statement that the Federal Reserve might at some point in the near future, if economic conditions so warrant, begin to pare back or taper its monthly asset purchases. The effect in the emerging market, sovereign bond markets, was immediate and savage. And the country that was hit hardest was Ukraine. The yields on 10-year Ukrainian sovereign debt soared from 7% to over 11%. Here you can see the data for the 7-year bond, which was where I could get the data on Bloomberg. But you see that after the taper comments, the yield really never comes back down. And at that level, the Yanukovych government could no longer roll over its debt. So they were in a huge crisis. You can see the yields come down briefly after they take the Russian bailout package offer, but then surge again when Ukrainians take to the streets and the revolution starts. Now, the taper didn't actually begin until January. So 6 months after Ben Bernanke's taper comments, you can make, I think, a pretty compelling argument that if the Fed had remained dovish in its language for another 6 months, Yanukovych might still be in power today, and there might never have been such a catastrophe. I'm not saying that should necessarily be accepted, but the environment was much calmer in January than it had been in May. Going forward, which countries should fear a repeat of the taper tantrum, or what I might call a rate ruckus, if the Federal Reserve were to hike rates sooner or more aggressively than the market is currently predicting? Well, you can see that the countries that were hit in 2013, countries on the right side of the figure, Turkey, Ukraine, Indonesia, Colombia, Brazil.
Next slide.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought it had gone. I apologize. Okay, on the right side of the graph, those are the countries with the largest current account deficits. So the reaction in the market was not indiscriminate. The markets punished countries that were running large current account deficits and were dependent upon the import of short-term capital, which was being facilitated by the Federal Reserve's monthly asset purchases. When Bernanke's taper comments came, these were the countries that were hit hardest. Now, if you look at the bottom of the graph, you will see that if you look at the current account deficits of those countries today, they are roughly in the same position that they were in 2013. So we really do have to be concerned that we might see a replay of the so-called taper tantrum later this year if the Federal Reserve acts more aggressively than the market is currently suggesting. Now, emerging markets have tried to get together and produce alternatives to the current international monetary regime, alternatives to the IMF in order to protect themselves. We've talked a bit about AIIB, but here I want to talk about the BRICS Bank and the so-called contingent reserve arrangement initiatives because we have far more data on those than we do on AIIB. We don't know about AIIB yet. But the contingent reserve arrangement that the BRICS have set up is in theory an alternative to the IMF. But if you look at the right side of the figure, you will see that in a crisis, Russia and Brazil would only be able to borrow $5.4 billion without being on an IMF program. To put that in perspective, if you look on the left side, you'll see that in the 1990s, the IMF approved lending to Russia of $38 billion. In 2002 alone, the IMF approved a standby credit arrangement for Brazil of $30 billion. And in 2002, net private financial flows to emerging markets were 1/10 of what they are today. So this money that the CRA is prepared to put up is completely irrelevant. I would argue that to even touch this money is to precipitate a crisis rather than prevent it, because you signal to the market that you're going to have to go to the IMF in due course. And you can see at the bottom of the figure how insignificant those numbers are compared to the foreign exchange reserves that those countries actually hold. Now, Russian President Vladimir Putin suggested that the new BRICS Bank was a way to free the international monetary and financial system from dependence on the US dollar. Well, let's look if that's the case. If you look at the World Bank's subscribed capital, you'll see only 10% of it is in US dollars, whereas 90% of it is in other currencies. In the case of the new BRICS Bank, 100% of the new $50 billion in subscribed capital is in US dollars. So not only does the BRICS Bank not free the world of dollar dependency, it has created a new source of global demand for dollar-denominated assets. It actually pushes in the other direction. Finally, many commentators have said that the new BRICS Bank is somehow more representative, or as Joseph Stiglitz said, more democratic than the World Bank. Let's look at that premise. If you look at the founding members of the World Bank, you will see that they now control less than 50% of the shares in the organization, 50% of the votes, whereas the 5 founding members of the BRICS Bank have arrogated to themselves a minimum of 55% of the voting shares permanently, no matter how the organization's membership might evolve in the future. So I want to wrap up. So I would just say that these things illustrate how just as it is easy to lament failures in American financial leadership, it is equally difficult to find alternatives to those Bretton Woods institutions, even when the resources are readily available. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ben. I got this book back in 2013. Even though I couldn't finish the book at the time. As an international political economist and former trade negotiator, I found this book fascinating and intriguing because you gave very live details, the whole process of learning up to making this conference, and also the featuring the star economist Keynes versus unlikely, the very shrewd strategist in the name of Harry Dexter White in his attempt to outmaneuvering, Keynes. And the reason why I was finding intriguing was, as you hear from Ben, Harry Dexter White was leading two different lives. So obvious question is, because he's the second life, in the process of creating this Bretton Woods system, he is some closeness to the Soviet Union. Did they play some damaging role to the interest of U.S. or not? That is going to be my first question to you.
Okay. Well, at Bretton Woods, I should emphasize that there is no element of Soviet monetary thinking in the architecture that Harry Dexter White put forward and that ultimately went through the organization. But that's because there was no Soviet monetary thinking to speak of. The Soviets were there at Bretton Woods for two reasons. First of all, they wanted to get more short-term credits from the United States, so they were there to investigate that possibility. And second, they liked the idea of a new international monetary system being based on gold, even if they wouldn't participate in it, because the Soviets had a lot of gold. Most of it was under the ground, but any new monetary system based on gold would boost the value of their gold stocks. So at Bretton Woods, there's no element of Soviet monetary thinking in the agreement. That said, White was very solicitous of the Soviet delegation at Bretton Woods. He made some major concessions to them that many of the European delegates were staunchly against. But over his time in Washington, he did engage in some activities on behalf of the Soviets, which were, to put it lightly, questionable. Just one example. In 1944, Henry Morgenthau put White in charge of producing the occupation currency for post-war Germany. The Soviets were demanding that the United States give them a copy of the currency plate so they could print up their own currency. Everyone in the administration was against this except Harry Dexter White. There was a vacuum of authority because Henry Morgenthau wasn't interested in this question. So White basically lied to the head of the Bureau of Printing and Engraving and said that General Marshall, on behalf of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, had demanded that the plates be sent over to the Soviets. They were delivered to the Soviets. The Soviets printed up about 80 billion occupation marks, or 8 times what the United States did. Those occupation marks eventually came back to Washington and were exchanged for U.S. dollars at the exchange rate fixed by Harry Dexter White, effectively raiding the U.S. Treasury for, in current dollars, $6 billion. And Harry Dexter White fully knew that this was going to happen. So this were the sort of activities he was involved in. One controversial part of the story, I won't focus on it now, but he actually played a significant role in the run-up to Pearl Harbor. The Soviets, as we only found out in the 1990s, had an intelligence initiative called Operation Snow, as in Snow White, to use Harry Dexter White as an agent of influence to convince the United States to take a hard line with Japan so that Japan will go to war with the United States rather than with the Soviet Union. It's a remarkable part of the story.
Yeah, you said this book was also translated in Chinese. And while I was reading this book, I was really amused by several places where you can simply replace the words US as China. Let me read a couple of those sentences. In your page on the chapter, The Best Laid Plans of White and Keynes, you said US was a benign emerging superpower and would use its power, unlike European imperialists before it, to create a world based on economic cooperation and non-discriminations,
yes,
and for instance, and so on. And as you mentioned, even though the initial belief where they're going to link a dollar to gold was not going to be no longer viable around 1971, but IMF system survived. But in this corner of the world, IMF is not much, quite welcome. They develop bad reputation because conditionality and so on. And precisely because of this, Japan made initiative in 1998, 1999 to create Asian version of IMF. But that was vehemently opposed by Larry Summers, and that was shut down. But now China is making new initiative. They make AIIB, and obviously they're quite successful at this time. So according to your analysis of history, and from this, perhaps I can pose a question. Are we witnessing the beginning of the end?
Not quite, and for two reasons. First, the IMF has proven quite adept at reinventing itself. The role it plays now was one that neither Keynes nor White ever envisioned, and they never would have approved of. Neither Keynes nor White ever wanted the IMF to be a crisis firefighter. The role of the IMF was to sort of grease the wheels of the system, and if there were signs that a crisis was coming, the individual countries in question should take action on their own, for example, devaluing their currencies. But the IMF was not supposed to intervene with massive bailout packages. But the IMF did reinvent itself, and now does play this role as crisis firefighter. Now, as you rightly point out, much of the world resents the role that the IMF plays in a crisis. But is there really an alternative to it? And I would argue that there's not. If you look at both the so-called Chiang Mai initiative and the new BRICS contingent reserve arrangement initiatives, both of them use the IMF as the bad cop. In other words, you can borrow almost nothing from Chiang Mai or BRICS unless you are on an IMF program. So the conditionality is never set by the BRICS, never set by Chiang Mai. It's all done by the wicked IMF. So how much money has been tapped from Chiang Mai? Zero. I mean, the BRICS Bank just started, but I think I illustrated to you that no one would ever want to tap into this money because it's so small unless you're on an IMF program. And if you have to be on an IMF program, you might as well just go to the IMF and cut out the middleman. So given that these new initiatives are using the IMF as a bad cop, I don't see its role going away anytime too soon. Having said that, I do think it is undercutting its own credibility with the new emerging powers by concentrating on certain crises where it probably should not have a role. I would argue that in the case of Greece, this problem could have been resolved with political will within the Eurozone. The resources were clearly there, and Greece should have restructured earlier. In the case of Ukraine, we're talking about a war zone. The IMF was never supposed to be lending into war zones because its conditionality is, on a practical level, ultimately irrelevant when you're dealing with a war zone situation. So I believe that if the United States and the Western powers want to provide Ukraine with aid, I think it's a wonderful idea. They should do it on their own, but they should not threaten the integrity of the IMF by putting them in a situation where almost certainly Ukraine will not be able to pay back this aid.
Yeah, I know the time is running out, but I'd like to pick up a couple of questions from Flo, very short questions. So the gentleman sitting here, yeah.
Thank you. You started your presentation by quoting President Sarkozy, who in 2011 called for a new Bretton Woods. The French have always held strong views about the international monetary systems. They always have been very influential at the IMF, yes, running the institution for most of its history. Indeed, one Harvard scholar, Ravi Abdallah, said that the Washington Consensus should be renamed the French Consensus or the Paris Consensus because of the role of the French nationals at the IMF, at the OECD, in the WTO, etc. So what was the role of the French delegation in Bretton Woods?
The French delegation at Bretton Woods was headed by a future Prime Minister, Pierre Mendès France. France was quite naturally in a fairly weak negotiating position at the conference. They mainly had one overriding aim, and I do talk in Chapter 8 on the conference of this rather pathetic in the sense of the term of pathos in English from the Greek negotiation between Mendès France and Henry Morgenthau. And Mendes France is pleading with him, don't let me go home without a narrative that I won. And he argued, first and foremost, that he needed to have more votes than the Benelux countries put together, because if the Benelux formed a political union, they would then be able to outvote France. Morgenthau put forward a compromise whereby the number of permanent executive director seats would be expanded to accommodate France, so that France would always have a seat. Now, after Bretton Woods, I think France played a very important role as a sort of conscientious objector to the international monetary system. President de Gaulle's primary economic advisor was a man named Jacques Rueff, who was one of the great defenders of the classical gold standard. And if you look at some of de Gaulle's speeches in the 1960s against the international monetary system and the role of the US dollar, they were clearly written by Jacques Rueff. Rueff was pushing for the world to go back to the old classical gold standard. The other alternative that was being fiercely debated at the time was to move in the direction of Keynes. The Belgian-American economist Robert Triffin was arguing in favor of Keynes's Bancor idea, which was eventually put into practice in a rather inconsequential form through the creation of SDRs in the IMF. But many of you may remember that in 2009, the Chinese central bank governor, Zhou Xiaochuan, produced a rather fascinating forthright statement saying that Bretton Woods may have been a terrible mistake and that we should have pursued the Keynes idea of a new supranational currency rather than the white idea, which led to the dollar taking on this role and all the perversities that flowed with that.
Yeah, I saw some more raising hands, but time is running out, so I wish you can take advantage of some break time to give some question to Ben. I think Asan prepared some small event to Arthur, so President Ham, please come forward.
No, thank you so much for Ben, but this is what we do to authors whose books
they prepare some
we
plate,
have the pleasure and honor of translating, and this is just something you can.
Thank you so much. That's beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You need to show them people. Yes, yeah. Please show them people.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I strongly recommend you read book for the details and for the thrilling anticlimax of Second Life of Harry White, but most importantly, what is going to future like, especially rivalry between Beijing and Washington. Thank you. Thank you.
We will now take a short break. Our next session will start at 1:30.